The room was filled with an unbearable silence, the kind that grips you and won't let go. I stood there, staring at the half-empty glass of wine in my hand, my mind lost in the heavy fog of guilt and confusion. It had been weeks since I first crossed that line. Weeks since I had stepped into something I never thought I would. And now, every moment felt like I was balancing on the edge of a cliff, wondering when everything would crumble beneath me. It didn't start out like this. It never does it? You never wake up one day planning to betray someone you love. Especially someone like Brian. My husband. He wasn't perfect, but he was good to me. Reliable. He had been the stable presence in my life for the past 8 years, and for the longest time that had been enough. But over time something inside me changed. Maybe it was the routine that began to wear me down, the predictability of our life together. Or maybe it was just the feeling that I was missing something, some thrill, some spark that I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't even pinpoint the exact moment I started feeling that way. But the yearning grew stronger with every passing day. And eventually it consumed me. I met them on a warm summer evening. Devin and Jalen. Both of them tall, confident, with this magnetic energy that drew me in the moment we crossed paths. They were friends of a friend, and when we met at a bar one night, something shifted inside me. I hadn't even intended to go out that night. Brian had been tired as usual, and we'd had another one of our dull dinners in front of the TV, barely talking about anything that mattered. I needed a break from the monotony, so I joined my friends for a drink, just to escape. First, it was just harmless conversation. The kind of banter that makes you feel young and alive again. They were charming, making me laugh in a way I hadn't in a long time. I remember thinking how easy it was to talk to them, how their smiles made my pulse quicken. Devin was smooth with this deep, rich voice that sent shivers down my spine, while Jalen had a playful side, teasing me in a way that made me forget, just for a moment, that I was someone's wife. I don't know when the harmless flirting crossed into something more dangerous. Maybe it was the second round of drinks. Or maybe it was the way Devin's hand brushed against mine when he reached for his glass. It was subtle, but it sparked something. The touch felt forbidden, thrilling. And yet, I didn't pull away. We ended up leaving the bar together, the three of us. I told myself it was innocent, just a fun night out with new friends. But deep down I knew where it was heading. We went back to Devin's apartment. I shouldn't have gone. I should have left right then and there, gone home to Brian and pretended that nothing was wrong. But I didn't. I followed them upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest, my skin tingling with a mix of fear and excitement. The apartment was small, modern, with dim lighting that set a certain mood. I remember the silence as we entered the living room, the way Devin looked at me, his eyes dark with intent. Jalen poured us another drink, but by then my senses were already buzzing. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your breath hitch in your throat. I could feel the heat between us, and it terrified me how much I wanted it. It didn't take long for things to escalate. Devin was the first to make a move, stepping closer, his hand grazing the small of my back, sending sparks of electricity through my body. I froze for a moment, my mind screaming at me to stop, to push him away, to remember who I was, who I belonged to. But my body had already made its decision. I leaned into his touch, letting go of the last remnants of guilt that had been holding me back. Before I knew it, I was kissing him. His lips were soft but demanding, his hands firm as they explored my body in ways that made my head spin. I had never been kissed like that, not by Brian, not by anyone. It was like Devin knew exactly how to touch me, how to ignite every nerve in my body. And then Jalen joined in, his hands on my hips, his breath hot against my neck. It was overwhelming, the intensity of it all, the way they moved around me, their touch a symphony of desire that I couldn't resist. I was lost in them, in the way their dark skin contrasted with mine, in the way they made me feel alive, powerful, desired in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew it was wrong. Every second, every kiss, every touch was a betrayal, but in that moment I didn't care. I was consumed by the heat, by the passion, by the thrill of doing something so utterly forbidden. The hours blurred together. Devin and Jalen took turns with me, their hands and mouths exploring every inch of my body. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before, raw, primal, and exhilarating. They made me forget everything. Forget who I was, forget my marriage, forget the life I had built with Brian. All that mattered in those moments was the pleasure, the intense, overwhelming pleasure that coursed through me with every touch, every movement. When it was over, I felt empty. Not just physically but emotionally. The weight of what I had done crashed down on me all at once, suffocating me. I left their apartment in a daze, my clothes wrinkled, my hair a mess, my mind racing with a million thoughts. As I walked down the street, the reality of my actions hit me like a tidal wave. I had crossed a line, one I could never uncross. I had betrayed Brian in the worst way possible, and there was no going back. The guilt was unbearable. Every time I looked at him after that night, I felt sick to my stomach. He didn't know. He couldn't know. I had become an expert at hiding my shame, at pretending that everything was fine. But inside I was crumbling. I had never felt so conflicted, so torn between the life I had with Brian and the fire that had been ignited inside me. Devin and Jalen reached out a few times after that night, but I never responded. I couldn't. The memory of what we had done was enough to haunt me, and I couldn't let myself fall any deeper into that abyss. But the damage was already done. I had opened a door that could never be closed, and now I was left to deal with the consequences of my actions. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I even can. The days that followed felt like a blur. A series of moments where I was present physically but completely detached mentally. I went through the motions with Brian: morning coffee, casual conversation, dinner in front of the TV, but all of it felt hollow. I would catch glimpses of myself in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back at me. I wasn't just keeping a secret from Brian. I was becoming someone I didn't understand. I thought I could bury it, that what happened with Devin and Jalen could be locked away in the deepest corner of my mind, never to resurface. But that's not how it works. Secrets like that don't stay hidden. They creep up on you in the quiet moments, when you're alone with your thoughts, when you're lying next to your husband and you can't sleep because your mind is spinning with guilt. The weight of what I had done was unbearable. It clung to me like a second skin, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, it wouldn't go away. I started to pull away from Brian without even realizing it. Little things at first. I avoided his touch, his kisses, his hugs. When he asked if everything was okay, I would smile and tell him I was just tired, that work had been stressful, or that I had a lot on my mind. He believed me because why wouldn't he? I had never given him a reason to doubt me before. But now, every time he looked at me, I felt like a fraud. Our sex life, which had already been lukewarm at best, became almost non-existent. I would make excuses, headaches, long days at work, anything to avoid being intimate with him. I knew it wasn't fair. I knew I was punishing him for something he didn't even know about, but I couldn't bring myself to pretend anymore. Every time he touched me, all I could think about was that night. About the way Devin's hands had felt on my skin, the way Jalen had whispered in my ear, making me feel things I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional too. I realized that what I had done wasn't just a betrayal of my body but of my heart. I had let someone else, two someone else's, into a space that had been reserved for Brian alone. And now that space was crowded with memories, with guilt, with a desire that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. One evening, a few weeks after it happened, Brian came home from work and found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a glass of wine. He could tell something was off. He always could, even when I thought I was doing a good job of hiding it. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. He wasn't accusing, just concerned. But his concern only made me feel worse. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just a long day." He didn't buy it. "We haven't been right lately," he said, sitting down across from me. "I feel like you're a million miles away." I couldn't look at him. The guilt was too heavy, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "For what?" he asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "For everything," I wanted to scream. "For betraying you. For lying to you. For ruining what we had." But instead I just shook my head. "I don't know," I said, my eyes filling with tears that I tried to blink away. I'm not myself lately." He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "We can get through this," he said softly. "Whatever it is, we can work it out. I love you." And that's when the tears really started. I couldn't hold them back anymore. They spilled down my cheeks hot and fast, and I hated myself for crying in front of him, for making him think this was about something else, something that could be fixed with time or effort or therapy. Because the truth was, I didn't know if we could get through this. I didn't know if I could ever look at him the same way again, knowing what I had done. I excused myself and went upstairs, leaving him sitting at the kitchen table, confused and worried. I sat on the edge of our bed, my hands trembling as I wiped at my eyes, trying to calm down. But nothing seemed to help. The guilt, the shame, the overwhelming sense that I had ruined everything. It was all consuming me. The next few days were even worse. Brian tried to be patient, giving me space but still checking in, trying to connect. But every time he asked if I was okay, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my secret. I couldn't keep lying to him. But I couldn't tell him the truth either. The truth would destroy him. It would destroy us. I started to consider leaving. Not for anyone else, not for Devin or Jalen or the thrill of something new, but just to escape the crushing guilt that had become my constant companion. I thought about packing a bag, writing a note and just disappearing. Maybe if I wasn't here, if I wasn't a daily reminder of my betrayal, Brian could move on and find someone who deserved him. Someone who wouldn't destroy everything the way I had. But every time I thought about leaving, I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to walk away from the life we had built together. Even if I had shattered it, I told myself that I owed him more than that. I owed him the chance to fight for us, even if I wasn't sure there was anything left to fight for. And then out of nowhere I got a message from Devin. I stared at my phone, my heart racing as his name flashed across the screen. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. I thought maybe he had moved on, forgotten about me, about that night. But here he was, pulling me back into the chaos I had been trying so hard to escape. "Hey, been thinking about you. You free tonight?" My fingers hovered over the screen, torn between blocking his number and responding. Part of me knew I should cut him off, that I should delete the message and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had been craving something more, something different, hesitated. That part of me remembered the way he made me feel, the way Jalen had looked at me like I was the most desirable woman in the world. That part of me wasn't ready to let go. Against my better judgment, I typed out a response. "I can't." It was a simple reply, but even typing those 2 words felt like a battle. I could feel the pull of temptation, the same pull that had led me to his apartment that night, the same pull that had made me lose control. A few moments later, my phone buzzed again. "Can't or won't?" I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. He was testing me, pushing me to see how far I would go. And the worst part was, I didn't know if I could resist. The memory of that night was still fresh in my mind, still alive in my body in a way that scared me. I wanted to be better, to be the kind of woman who could walk away from temptation, but I wasn't sure I was that woman anymore. And then, without thinking, I found myself typing another message. "Not tonight." It wasn't a no. Not really. It was a maybe. A door left slightly ajar. And as soon as I hit send, I regretted it. But it was too late. The message was out there, and now I was left to wonder what would happen next. Would I fall back into old patterns? Would I betray Brian again? Or would I finally find the strength to stop this madness before it consumed me completely? I didn't know. All I knew was that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong step could send me crashing down into a place I might never recover from. The next few days were agonizing. I carried my phone everywhere, my heart sinking every time it buzzed, wondering if Devin would reach out again. I was trapped in this sick cycle of fear and anticipation, knowing that I should have blocked his number, knowing that I should have erased every trace of him from my life. And yet I hadn't. I couldn't. Brian continued to act as if everything were normal, and that was the worst part. He had no idea the storm that was brewing beneath the surface, no idea that I was standing on the precipice of another mistake. He would look at me across the dinner table, smiling as if our life hadn't been torn apart at the seams, as if I wasn't a stranger to him now. I hated myself for how easy it was to lie, to smile back, to kiss him goodnight like nothing had changed. But inside, everything was different. I thought about Devin constantly, replaying that night in my mind with a mix of guilt and desire. The way his hands had felt, the way he had looked at me as if I were the only woman in the world. It was intoxicating, that feeling of being wanted, of being desired in a way I hadn't been in years. Brian loved me, but his love was comfortable, predictable. Devin's attention had been something else entirely. Wild, untamed, dangerous. It was that danger that both terrified and thrilled me. I began to notice changes in myself that I couldn't explain. Little things at first, wearing makeup more often, spending extra time on my hair before leaving the house. I would catch myself looking in the mirror longer than usual, wondering if Devin and Jalen would still find me as desirable now, after the weight of everything that had happened. I hated that I cared. I hated that their opinion of me still lingered in my mind. One evening, about a week after Devin's message, I found myself in a grocery store parking lot, sitting in my car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. I had just finished work, and instead of going home to Brian, I had driven here mindlessly without a plan. My phone sat on the passenger seat, taunting me. I could feel it there, as if it were burning a hole through the leather. I didn't need to look at it to know that his message was still there, waiting. I closed my eyes, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white. I could feel the pull again, that magnetic force that had drawn me into their world in the first place. My mind was at war with itself, one side screaming at me to block Devin, to go home, to fix things with Brian before it was too late. The other side whispered seductively, telling me that one more night wouldn't hurt, that it didn't matter anymore. That side reminded me of the excitement, the thrill, the way my heart had raced in their presence. And then, as if some unseen force had taken control of me, I reached for my phone. My hand shook as I unlocked it, my thumb hovering over Devin's message. I knew I shouldn't reply. I knew this was the moment where I could still turn back, where I could stop the train before it derailed completely. But I didn't. Maybe tomorrow, I typed, my fingers trembling as I hit send. The moment I pressed the button, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. What was I doing? Why couldn't I stop this? I was spiraling out of control, and I didn't know how to pull myself back. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my phone still in my hand, my mind spinning with a million different thoughts. And then it buzzed. Tomorrow works for me. Let's make it worth it. I felt my stomach churn. This was real now. I had agreed to meet him again, knowing full well what that would mean. Knowing that I was about to betray Brian for a second time. But despite the guilt, despite the overwhelming sense of dread that settled in my chest, I couldn't bring myself to call it off. That night I barely slept. I lay in bed next to Brian, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind replaying that message over and over again. Every time he shifted beside me, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my lies. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve any of it. But I couldn't stop. I was caught in this whirlwind, and the more I tried to resist, the more I was pulled deeper into it. The next day at work I couldn't focus. My mind was consumed with thoughts of Devin, with what was going to happen that evening. Every time my phone buzzed I jumped, half expecting it to be him, half hoping that something would happen to stop this before it could begin. But nothing did. By the time I left the office my nerves were shot. My hands were shaking as I drove, my mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios. I knew what I was about to do, but I wasn't ready to face it. I wasn't ready to admit that I was choosing this, that I was willingly stepping back into the same mess I had barely escaped from the first time. Devin had sent me an address earlier that day, some hotel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't far, but the drive felt like an eternity. Every red light, every stop sign felt like a chance to turn around, to go home, to pretend that this wasn't happening. But I kept driving. I kept moving forward, 1 mile at a time, until I found myself pulling into the parking lot. The hotel was nondescript, the kind of place where no one asks questions, where anonymity is guaranteed. I sat in the car for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. But I couldn't stop. I checked my phone one last time. Room 213. Devin had written.
No explanation, no greeting.
Just the number. It was clinical, detached, as if this were just another transaction. But that didn't surprise me. He wasn't interested in anything beyond what had already happened between us. This wasn't about feelings. This wasn't about love. This was about something raw, something physical, something I had allowed to consume me once before. With a deep breath I stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hitting my skin like a wake-up call. I should leave, I thought. I should turn around and drive home. But my legs carried me forward, up the stairs, down the dimly lit hallway, until I was standing in front of room 213. I knocked, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode. There was a pause, a brief moment where I thought maybe he wasn't there. Maybe this was all a mistake. But then the door opened and Devin stood there. His expression calm, controlled, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let me pass. I hesitated for a moment, my body frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me with a finality that sent chills down my spine. The room was small, simple. Just a bed, a chair, a TV mounted on the wall. But it didn't matter. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. Devin moved closer, his eyes locking onto mine, and I felt that same electric charge I had felt the first night. My body responded to him before my mind could catch up, my pulse quickening, my breath coming in shallow gasps. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His hands were on me before I could process what was happening. His lips crashing against mine with a hunger that sent shivers down my spine. I melted into him, my body betraying me once again, my hands gripping his shirt, pulling him closer, even as my mind screamed at me to stop. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The next hour was a blur of heat and movement, of hands and mouths and skin pressed against skin. It was just like before, wild, raw, intense. Devin knew exactly how to touch me, how to make me forget everything else. And for a while I let him. I let myself be consumed by the moment, by the pleasure, by the escape. But when it was over, when the adrenaline had faded and reality came crashing back, I felt worse than I ever had before. I lay there in the silence, staring at the ceiling, my body still trembling from the intensity of it all. Devin was beside me, his breathing steady, his arm draped casually over my waist. But I felt empty, hollow. I had done it again. I had betrayed Brian. And this time I wasn't sure I could ever forgive myself. I left the hotel without a word, slipping out of the bed and gathering my clothes in silence. Devin didn't stop me. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't offer any reassurances. This was just another night for him, just another notch on his belt. But for me it was something much darker, much more destructive. As I drove home, the weight of my actions pressed down on me like a heavy stone. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep lying to Brian, pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. Something had to change. Something had to give. But I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to fix the mess I had made. The guilt gnawed at me like a parasite, eating away at my sense of self. Every time I looked at Brian, I could feel the weight of my lies crushing me, suffocating me in the silence of our home. I went through the motions of our daily life, trying to pretend that nothing had changed. But it had. Everything had. Brian wasn't stupid. He could sense that something was wrong, but I was still hiding behind my well-rehearsed excuses. The more I lied, the deeper I buried myself in this pit of shame. And the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was disappearing. I was no longer the woman I used to be, the woman Brian had fallen in love with. I had become someone else, someone I didn't even recognize anymore. One night, about a week after the second meeting with Devin, Brian and I were sitting on the couch watching TV. He was flipping through channels aimlessly, and I was barely paying attention. I could feel the distance between us growing wider with every passing day. But I didn't know how to close it. I didn't know how to fix the chasm that I had created. "I miss you," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the hurt in his voice, the sadness that he had been trying so hard to hide. "I'm right here," I replied, my voice weak, knowing how hollow those words were. He turned to look at me, his eyes searching my face for something. An answer, a sign, anything that could explain why I had become so distant. "No, you're not. You haven't been here for a while. It's like you're slipping away from me." I swallowed hard, trying to fight back the tears that were threatening to spill over. I couldn't lie to him anymore, but I couldn't tell him the truth either. The truth would shatter him. It would destroy us. But the lies were eating me alive. "I've just been stressed," I whispered, my hands shaking in my lap. "Work's been crazy. I'm sorry if I've been distant." Brian shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It's more than that, and you know it. This isn't just work stress, and I'm not stupid. I know something's going on with you, and I'm scared, okay? I'm scared I'm losing you." I bit my lip, trying to hold back the sob that was building in my throat. He was right. He was losing me, but not in the way he thought. He was losing me to a version of myself that I didn't even understand. A version that had fallen into the arms of two strangers, and let them take me away from everything I had once cherished. I don't know what to say. I finally choked out, feeling the cracks in my facade start to widen. I don't know how to explain what I'm feeling. I don't even know if I understand it myself. Brian's face softened, and he reached out to take my hand. His touch was gentle, comforting, the way it had always been. And in that moment I hated myself even more for what I had done. How could I have betrayed him like that? How could I have let myself be swept away by something so meaningless when I had someone like him? "We can figure it out," he said quietly. "Whatever it is, we can work through it. I just need you to be honest with me." His words hung in the air like a lifeline, and for a brief moment, I considered telling him everything. Maybe it would be better to come clean, to rip off the bandage and let the truth spill out. But then the image of Devin and Jalen flashed through my mind, and I felt sick. I couldn't do it. I couldn't tell him. The damage was too great and there was no going back. "I'll try," I whispered, squeezing his hand. "I'll try to be better." It was a half-truth. I wanted to be better. I wanted to fix things, to find a way back to the life we had before. But I didn't know if I could. The pull of temptation, the thrill of the forbidden, still lingered in the back of my mind, taunting me, reminding me of the fire that Devin and Jalen had ignited in me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Brian's steady breathing beside me. He had fallen asleep, but I couldn't. My mind was racing, my heart pounding with the weight of everything I had been carrying. I thought about leaving again, about packing a bag in the middle of the night and disappearing, sparing him the pain of finding out the truth. But I couldn't do that either. No matter how broken I felt, I couldn't just walk away. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Devin. "Still thinking about you. Last time was fun. Let's do it again." My stomach twisted into knots. I should have deleted the message. I should have blocked his number and put an end to this once and for all. But instead I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen, torn between two worlds. One that was safe and familiar, and one that was dangerous and exhilarating. I didn't respond. Not right away. But the temptation was still there, gnawing at me, pulling me back toward the edge of the cliff I had been standing on for weeks. I knew that if I let myself fall again, there would be no coming back. This would be the point of no return. Days passed and I tried to throw myself into my marriage, into my work, into anything that could distract me from the pull of Devin. But nothing worked. He was always there, lurking in the corners of my mind, reminding me of the thrill I had felt in his presence. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't deny the truth. Part of me wanted to go back. One Friday evening, after Brian had left for a late meeting with his colleagues, I found myself alone in the house, the silence pressing down on me. I poured myself a glass of wine, trying to drown out the noise in my head, but it didn't help. The thoughts kept swirling louder and louder, until I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Devin. "When?" The reply came almost immediately. "Tonight. Usual place." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what I was doing. I knew I was about to make the same mistake all over again, but I didn't stop myself. I was on autopilot now, moving through the motions as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. I left the house without a second thought, driving to the same hotel where everything had started to unravel. The familiar anxiety bubbled up inside me as I walked down the hallway toward his room. But this time it was mixed with something else. Something darker, more dangerous. It was the knowledge that I was no longer in control of myself, that I had let this spiral so far out of control that I didn't even know how to stop. Devin opened the door, his eyes glinting with that same confident smirk that had drawn me in the first time. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside to let me in. I felt my pulse quicken, that familiar rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. The thrill of the forbidden was intoxicating, and once again, I let myself be swept away. The night unfolded like a twisted replay of the first time. His hands on my skin, his breath hot against my neck, the overwhelming rush of desire that made me forget everything else. But this time it wasn't just Devin. Jalen showed up too, just like before, and the room became a haze of tangled limbs, heated whispers and raw, unbridled passion. It was darker this time, more intense. There was no pretense of seduction, no slow build-up. It was fast, frenzied, as if we were all trying to consume each other before the night slipped away. I lost myself in the heat of their touch, in the way they made me feel alive, powerful, free from the chains of guilt that had been dragging me down. For those few hours, I didn't think about Brian, didn't think about the life I was destroying. All that mattered was the present, the way my body reacted to theirs, the way their hands brought me to the edge of oblivion and back again. But when it was over, the emptiness returned. It always did. As I dressed in the dim light of the hotel room, the reality of what I had done crashed down on me like a tidal wave. I had done it again. I had crossed the line, and this time I wasn't sure there was any way back. Devin and Jalen didn't say much as I left. This wasn't about emotions for them. It never had been. I was just a diversion, something to satisfy their desires for the night. But for me, this was something far more destructive. I was unraveling and I didn't know how to stop. As I drove home in the darkness, my mind raced with thoughts of what I had just done. I felt sick, disgusted with myself, but there was also a strange sense of relief. At least for a while, I had escaped the suffocating guilt that had been drowning me. But now it was back, heavier than ever, and I didn't know how to live with it. When I got home, the house was quiet. Brian wasn't back yet, and I was grateful for the few moments of solitude. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the clock, my heart still racing from the adrenaline. What was I doing? What had I become? I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear my skin off and escape the person I had become. But there was no escaping this. I had made my bed, and now I was lying in it, tangled in the sheets of my own betrayal. And the worst part was I didn't know how to stop. The days after that third encounter passed in a numb blur. I could barely function at work, my mind constantly drifting back to the hotel room, to the feeling of their hands on me, to the overwhelming guilt that followed every moment of illicit pleasure. I avoided Brian even more, finding excuses to stay late at the office or retreat into the bedroom early in the evening. It was as if I couldn't bear to be around him anymore. As if his presence was a constant reminder of my betrayal. Every time he looked at me with those soft, trusting eyes, my stomach twisted into knots, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I hated what I had done. I hated the person I was becoming, someone I never thought I would be, a liar, a cheater. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the pull that Devin and Jalen had over me. It wasn't just the physical connection, though that was part of it. It was the way they made me feel, the way they ignited something in me that had been dormant for years. With them, I wasn't just Brian's wife, trapped in the routine of a marriage that had lost its spark. With them, I was someone else, someone reckless, someone wild, someone free. I told myself after that night that it would be the last time. I wouldn't see them again. I wouldn't let myself slip further into the abyss I had already created. But those were just empty promises, made in the haze of guilt and shame that washed over me every time I left the hotel. Because deep down I knew the truth. I wasn't done. Not yet. The next week, the tension between Brian and me hit a breaking point. It was a Wednesday night, and we were sitting at the dinner table, the silence between us so thick you could almost feel it. He was poking at his food, barely eating, and I could tell by the way he kept glancing at me that he was working up the courage to say something. Finally, he put his fork down and looked at me, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said quietly. My heart sank. I had been dreading this moment, knowing it was inevitable. Brian was too perceptive not to notice how distant I had become, how different everything was between us. He might not know exactly what I had done, but he knew something was wrong. About what? I asked, my voice weak, as if I didn't already know the answer. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. About us. About what's been going on. I feel like I don't even know you anymore. Like you're slipping away from me, and I don't know why. You won't talk to me, you won't let me in. I need to know what's going on because I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. I stared down at my plate, my appetite completely gone. The weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating me. This was my chance to tell him the truth, to come clean and try to salvage whatever was left of our marriage. But I couldn't do it. The words were stuck in my throat, tangled up with all the lies I had been telling. I don't know what to say, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Things have been hard lately. I've been feeling off. He leaned forward, his expression pained. Off how? Is it me? Is there something I've done? No, I said quickly, shaking my head. It's not you. It's just, I don't know. I feel like I've lost myself somewhere along the way. Brian reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle, pleading. We can figure this out together. But I need you to be honest with me. I need to know what's really going on. I looked into his eyes and for a moment, I felt the weight of my guilt pressing down so hard I thought I might break. How could I do this to him? How could I betray someone who loved me so deeply? Who was willing to fight for us, even when I had already walked away in my heart? But I couldn't tell him. The truth would destroy him, and I wasn't brave enough to face the consequences of my actions. So I lied. Again. I'm just stressed, I said, forcing a weak smile. Work has been overwhelming, and I guess I've been taking it out on you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to push you away. Brian's face softened, relief washing over him as he squeezed my hand. We'll get through this, he said softly. We always do. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. As much as I wanted to fix things, as much as I wanted to be the wife Brian deserved, I wasn't sure I knew how anymore. I had fallen so far down this rabbit hole that I didn't know how to climb out. That night I lay in bed next to Brian, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just done. I had lied to him again, buried the truth even deeper. And for what? To protect him? Or was it to protect myself from the fallout that would inevitably come if he ever found out? I wasn't sure anymore. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Devon's name flash across the screen. Miss you. Can't stop thinking about you. I should have ignored it. I should have turned my phone off and gone to sleep, but I didn't. Instead, I picked it up and stared at the message, my pulse quickening. Every time Devon reached out, I felt that familiar pull, that dangerous allure that had drawn me to him in the first place. No matter how much I tried to fight it, I couldn't shake the desire that still burned inside me. I typed a response before I could stop myself. I miss you too. The words felt heavy as I hit send, but there was no taking them back now. The line had been crossed again, and I was already teetering on the edge of another mistake. The next morning, Devon sent me another message. Let's meet tonight. Same place. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. This was it, the moment where I had to make a choice. I could walk away, delete his number, and try to rebuild my life with Brian. Or I could keep spiraling deeper into this mess, knowing full well that it would only end in disaster. But the truth was, I already knew what I was going to do. That evening, after Brian left for another late meeting, I found myself driving to the same hotel. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. I hated myself for doing this, for letting this addiction control me. But I couldn't stop. It was like a drug and I was hooked. Devon was waiting for me when I arrived. The moment I stepped into the room, he pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine in a way that made my head spin. It was the same every time. This rush of desire, this intoxicating need to lose myself in him. And once again I let it happen. Jalen showed up not long after, and the night unfolded just as it had before, wild, raw, passionate. For a few hours I was someone else, someone who didn't have a husband waiting for her at home. Someone who wasn't drowning in guilt and shame. But when it was over, the emptiness returned, heavier than ever. As I left the hotel, I felt a sinking feeling settle in my chest. I had done it again, betrayed Brian in the worst way possible. And this time I wasn't sure I would be able to live with the consequences. When I got home, Brian was already asleep, his face peaceful in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. I stood there for a long time watching him, wondering how I had let things get this bad. How had I gone from being the woman who loved him with everything I had to the woman who was lying to him every day? I crawled into bed beside him, my heart heavy with the weight of my secrets. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The guilt was too overwhelming, suffocating me in the darkness. The next morning, Brian kissed me goodbye before heading to work, his touch gentle, affectionate. I forced a smile, pretending everything was fine, even though I was falling apart inside. As soon as he was gone, I collapsed onto the couch, burying my face in my hands as the tears finally came. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep lying, keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it soon. But even as the tears fell, I knew the truth. I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet.